There are thresholds in your life that you do not recognize until you are standing squarely upon them, with one foot in the world you knew and the other dangling over the precipice of a world you could only ever imagine. They rarely announce themselves with thunder or ceremony. More often, they arrive in silence, disguised as something ordinary, something mundane. They come dressed as a Tuesday night, smelling of laundry and old books, and they wait for you to notice the subtle shift in the air, the way the light from the street lamp outside seems to hold its breath. For me, that threshold was the landscape of my own living room couch, and the weight of my best friend's head resting on my chest was the only signpost marking the edge of everything I had ever understood about myself, about him, and about the fragile architecture of the world we had built together. Julian was asleep. It was a fact as simple and as profound as the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing against my ribs. In the quiet dark of my apartment, that sound was the only percussion, a steady, anchoring beat in the vast, silent symphony of the night. His hair, which always seemed to have a life of its own, a chaotic masterpiece of dark waves he was constantly trying to tame, was soft against my chin, and I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, a fragrance that had somehow become as familiar to me as the smell of the developing fluid in my darkroom. His arm was thrown loosely across my stomach, his fingers curled into the fabric of my t-shirt, a gesture of unconscious possession that sent a tremor of pure, unadulterated terror and something dangerously close to hope through my entire body. I was a cartographer of a forbidden country, mapping the slope of his shoulder, the curve of his spine, the peaceful geography of his sleeping face, illuminated in the pale, silver wash of moonlight filtering through the window. This moment, I knew, was the culmination of 1,000 smaller moments, a quiet delta where countless streams of unspoken feelings had finally converged. It was the answer to a question I had never dared to ask, the end of a sentence I had been holding in my lungs for years. But it was also a beginning, and that was the truly terrifying part. Beginnings are fragile things, easily broken. They are rooms without doors, filled with a light so new and so bright it can blind you. I lay there, pinned beneath the gentle, trusting weight of him, and I thought about the nature of silence. There is the silence of emptiness, a hollow, echoing void. And then there is the silence of fullness, a quiet so dense with meaning that it feels heavier than any sound. This was the latter. It was a silence filled with the history of our friendship, with the ghost of his recent heartbreak, with the slow, tectonic shift that had been happening between us for months, a geological change so gradual I had almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But there was no imagining this. The solid, warm reality of him was an irrefutable truth against my body, and I was left with the dizzying, heart-stopping realization that the threshold had been crossed, not with a leap, but with a slow, unconscious lean, and I had no idea what lay on the other side. All I could do was hold my breath and try not to move, terrified that any motion might shatter the beautiful, impossible stillness of it all. I met Julian during the first week of our freshman year of college, in the chaotic, overlit lobby of our dormitory. He was the center of a swirling galaxy of people, a sun pulling everyone into his orbit with an effortless gravitational force. He was telling a story, his hands punctuating the air with sharp, decisive gestures, his laugh a loud, bright sound that seemed to paint the drab, cinder-block walls with color. I was on the periphery, as I always was, a quiet moon content in its distant orbit, trying to navigate the logistics of a broken laundry card machine. He saw me, and for a reason I will never understand, he broke from his constellation and drifted over. He had a smile that felt like an event, something you should have bought a ticket for. It was wide and genuine and completely disarming. He had solved my laundry card issue in under 30 seconds, charmed the resident advisor into giving me a new one, and learned my entire life story in the span of 5 minutes, all while making me feel like I was the most interesting person he had ever met. That was his gift. Julian had a way of creating space for people, of shining his considerable light on them until they felt they were glowing, too. For an introverted photography student who communicated better with light and shadow than with words, he was a revelation. Our friendship formed in the way that only college friendships can, forged in the crucible of late-night study sessions fueled by terrible coffee, shared pizzas eaten on the floor, and the mutual discovery of a new and overwhelming world. He was the extrovert to my introvert, the spontaneous energy to my careful planning, the words to my images. He would drag me to parties where I would stand awkwardly in a corner, and he would always find his way back to me, a drink in hand, ready to anchor me when the social currents grew too strong. In return, I offered him a port in his own storm. My room became his sanctuary, a quiet place where the relentless pressure he put on himself to be bright, to be on, could be set aside. He would lie on my floor, staring at the ceiling, and just be quiet, an act that seemed like a profound relief for him. I can pinpoint the exact moment the foundation of our friendship shifted for me. It was sophomore year, late in the spring. We were studying for finals, spread out on a blanket on the main campus lawn. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming azaleas. Julian was lying on his stomach, reading a dense political science textbook, his brow furrowed in concentration. A stray breeze lifted a lock of his hair and brushed it across his forehead. Without thinking, I reached out and tucked it behind his ear. It was the smallest of gestures, an act of unconscious tidiness, nothing more. But the moment my fingers brushed against the warmth of his skin, a jolt went through me, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. He glanced up from his book, his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of green, like sea glass, met mine. He didn't say anything. He just held my gaze for a beat too long, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before offering a small, distracted smile and turning back to his page. For him, the moment was nothing. It was forgotten as soon as it happened. For me, it was a chemical reaction, a point of no return. It was the moment a quiet, manageable affection metastasized into a deep, aching, and utterly impossible love. I saw him, suddenly, not as a collection of friendly gestures and shared jokes, but as a whole and beautiful person, and the sight of him stole the air from my lungs. From that day on, I lived in a state of carefully managed awareness. I became an expert in the art of loving from a distance, of building internal walls so high and so thick that the friendship could remain safe within their confines. I learned to interpret his casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, an arm slung around my neck, as the platonic gestures they were, even as my own skin burned at the contact. I was a photographer, after all. My job was to observe, to capture a moment without altering it. And so I observed him, loved him from behind the safety of my lens, capturing the way he laughed, the way he ran a hand through his hair when he was stressed, the quiet vulnerability that sometimes surfaced in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He dated, of course. He fell in and out of love with a series of smart, beautiful women, and I played my part perfectly. I was the supportive best friend, the one who listened to him dissect first dates, the one who helped him pick out birthday presents, the one who offered a shoulder when things inevitably fell apart. Each new girlfriend was a fresh layer of brick on the walls I had built around my heart. It was a peculiar kind of self-inflicted torture, listening to the man you love talk about the woman he loves. But the alternative, losing him altogether, was unthinkable. The friendship was the most vital architecture in my life, and I would do anything to protect its foundation, even if it meant living in a single, unlit room within it. I resigned myself to my role. I was the quiet observer, the keeper of his stories, the silent harbor. It was enough. It had to be. For 8 years, through college and into the uncertain landscape of our 20s, it was enough. Until the day it wasn't. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event that fractured the landscape of Julian's life. It arrived in the form of a phone call on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was in my darkroom, the faint, acidic smell of fixer clinging to the air, watching an image of a winter bear tree slowly emerge on a sheet of photographic paper submerged in the developer. My phone, left on the counter, buzzed against the metal surface, a harsh, intrusive sound in the sacred quiet. I almost ignored it, but a strange, insistent feeling, a prickle of unease at the base of my neck, made me wipe my hands and answer. It was Julian. All he said was my name, but the sound of it was enough. Leo. His voice was wrecked. It was a ruin of what it should have been, stripped of its usual warmth and confidence, leaving only a raw, hollowed-out rasp. I had heard him tired. I had heard him stressed. I had even heard him sad after previous, less significant breakups. But I had never heard this sound before. This was the sound of a building collapsing in on itself. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I knew. His 3-year relationship with Amelia, a woman I had always found perfectly nice and perfectly wrong for him, had finally imploded. He had been trying to hold it together for months, patching cracks and ignoring structural warnings, convinced he could fix it through sheer force of will. "It's over," he whispered, and the words seemed to catch in his throat, sharp and jagged. "She's gone. She packed her things while I was at work. Just gone." My own heart, that traitorous and hopeful thing, gave a sickening lurch, a pang of something I refused to name, which was immediately drowned by a wave of profound sympathy for his pain. The image in the developing tray was forgotten. The world outside my small, dark room ceased to exist. My only purpose, my only function, was him. I didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He wasn't calling for advice. He was calling for an anchor. So I became one. I spoke to him in a low, steady voice, asking simple, logistical questions. Had he eaten? Was he at his apartment? Did he need me to come over? His answers were monosyllabic, lost in the fog of his shock. I told him to stay put, that I was on my way. When I arrived at his apartment, the door was ajar. The place was unervingly silent. It was always so full of his energy, of music or the sound of the television, but now it felt like a vacuum. He was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the negative space of a life that had just been dismantled. There were pale rectangles on the walls where her pictures had been, empty shelves on the bookcase, a conspicuous void on the coffee table where her collection of ceramic birds used to sit. He didn't look up when I came in. He just stared at a spot on the hardwood floor as if it held the answers to the universe. I didn't say anything. I just went to his kitchen, which was as sterile and unused as always, and made him a cup of tea, the way my mother used to for me when I was sick. I put the mug in his hands, and his fingers were cold, unresponsive. He held it, but didn't drink. I sat on the floor with him, a few feet away, and we stayed like that for what felt like hours, 2 ships moored in a silent, desolate harbor. That night was the beginning of the change. His apartment, once a symbol of his independent, adult life with Amelia, had become a mausoleum of their shared past. Every corner held a memory, every object was a ghost. He couldn't bear to be there. So, he started gravitating toward my place. My small, quiet apartment, filled with books and camera equipment and the smell of my darkroom chemicals, became his refuge. At first, it was just for a few hours in the evening. He would show up at my door, looking lost and exhausted, and I would let him in without a word. We would order takeout and watch mindless television, the dialogue filling the spaces he couldn't fill himself. He rarely spoke about Amelia, but her absence was a third person in the room with us, a palpable presence. I didn't push. I just let him be, let him heal at his own pace. I became a purveyor of quiet comfort, a constant, steady presence in the wreckage of his life. The lines of our friendship, once so clearly defined, began to blur. He was no longer just my best friend who had a girlfriend. He was just Julian, and he was here, in my space, in my life, in a way he had never been before. The walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart began to feel less like a fortress and more like a prison. And for the first time in a long time, a dangerous, fragile tendril of hope began to push its way through the cracks. The ritual began with the phone calls. They started about a week after the breakup, once the initial shock had worn off and the deep, gnawing ache of loneliness had set in. My phone would ring long after the city had fallen quiet, usually sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. The first time it happened, my heart seized with a familiar, panicked dread, the kind that only a late-night call can inspire, assuming the worst. But it was just Julian, his voice small and threaded with exhaustion. "Hey," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sorry, did I wake you?" I had been awake, of course, staring at my ceiling, my mind a relentless carousel of thoughts, most of them about him. "No, I was up. What's going on? Are you okay?" "Yeah." "No, I don't know." He'd sighed, and I could hear the rustle of sheets, could picture him lying in his bed, in that too empty apartment, staring at his own ceiling. "It's just quiet here. It's too quiet. I can't sleep." So we talked. I lay in my bed, the phone pressed to my ear, and I listened. He talked about his day at work, about a stupid project that was going nowhere, about an article he'd read online. He talked about anything and everything except the one thing that was keeping him awake. He was circling the silence, filling it with words so he wouldn't have to feel its weight. I mostly listened, offering a quiet murmur of agreement here, a soft question there. I was a lighthouse keeper, sending out a steady, low signal into his darkness, letting him know he wasn't alone on the water. After an hour or so, his words would start to slur, his sentences would trail off, and I would hear his breathing deepen and even out. I would stay on the line for a few more minutes, listening to the sound of him sleeping, before whispering a goodbye he wouldn't hear and gently ending the call. This became our new routine. Every night, or every other night, the call would come. The pretexts grew thinner. It was no longer about a specific problem or a need to vent. The calls became shorter, more elemental. One night, he called, and after I answered, there was a long pause. I could hear his breath, soft and steady. "Julian?" I asked, my voice gentle. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm here. I just needed to hear your voice for a minute." That sentence landed in my chest like a stone, sinking deep and sending ripples through my entire system. It was a confession of needs so pure, so stripped of artifice, that it left me breathless. I was no longer just a distraction from the silence. I was the sound he sought out within it. My voice was his comfort. The knowledge was a heavy, precious thing. I held it close, examining it from every angle in the long, quiet hours after he had fallen asleep. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. He was hurting, and I was his friend, and this was my job. But the hope, that tenacious weed, was growing stronger, wrapping itself around my carefully constructed logic and pulling it apart. These late-night calls were our own private language, a conversation happening in the spaces between the words, in the shared silences and the soft, synchronized breathing across the line. Then the ritual evolved, moving from the ethereal space of phone calls into the physical reality of my living room. The movie nights started innocently enough. It was a way to get him out of his apartment, to give him a change of scenery. We'd order a pizza and scroll through streaming services, engaging in the familiar, low-stakes debate over what to watch. We'd sit on my old, comfortable couch, initially at opposite ends, a respectable, friendly distance between us. A DMZ of cushions and folded blankets. But as the weeks wore on, that distance began to shrink. The erosion was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. A foot brushing against mine, a shoulder leaning in to see the screen better. Small, casual incursions into personal space that could be easily dismissed, easily explained away. Plausible deniability was the name of the game, and we were both masters of it. I remember the first time he broke the unspoken rule in a way that couldn't be ignored. We were watching some sprawling, epic fantasy film, something long and visually dense. About 2 hours in, I felt a weight settle against my shoulder. I froze, my entire body going rigid. It was Julian. He had fallen asleep, his head slumping sideways to rest against me. My first instinct was to move, to gently wake him and restore the boundary. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But I couldn't. I sat there, ramrod straight, my muscles screaming in protest, for the entire remaining hour of the film. I was acutely aware of every single point of contact. The pressure of his head on my shoulder, the warmth seeping through the fabric of our shirts, the soft tickle of his hair against my neck. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm that I was sure he must be able to feel. When the credits rolled, I finally dared to move, gently shifting so that his head was resting against the arm of the couch. He mumbled something in his sleep, but didn't wake. I draped a blanket over him and went to my own bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying the feeling of his weight against me, the ghost of it a permanent fixture on my shoulder. After that night, the dam broke. The pretense of distance was abandoned. The next movie night, he didn't wait to fall asleep. He just leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I, in turn, learned to relax into it, to let my own body soften. My apartment was his safe harbor, and I, it seemed, was his physical anchor within it. The couch became our shared territory. He would curl up against my side, his legs tangled with mine, his arm often draped across my chest. It was a strange and dizzying intimacy, a physical closeness that far surpassed anything we had ever shared before, all under the guise of platonic comfort. I was his human weighted blanket, his port in a storm of grief and loneliness. I told myself that was all it was. It was a story I repeated to myself like a mantra, a prayer against my own burgeoning hope. He was hurting. He needed a friend. This didn't mean what I wanted it to mean. But my body betrayed my logic. My body knew. It hummed with a low-grade electricity whenever he was near. I was hyper-aware of the scent of his skin, the texture of his worn-out college sweatshirt, the way his chest would rumble with a quiet laugh when something on screen amused him. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the sheer, unadulterated joy of having him so close and the paralyzing fear of what would happen when he no longer needed this comfort. What would happen when he healed? Would he retreat back to his side of the couch, the space between us yawning open once more? The thought was a cold knot of dread in my stomach. So I savored these moments, these stolen bits of closeness, archiving them in my memory like precious negatives. I was a man dying of thirst, and he was offering me water, not realizing I was dreaming of an ocean. I drank what he offered, gratefully, and tried to pretend it was enough. The final phase of the ritual was the door. My bedroom door, to be precise. It began on a night when a movie ended so late, and we were both so tired that the idea of him driving back to his empty apartment felt cruel. "Just crash on the couch," I'd said, already pulling a pillow and a thicker blanket from the hall closet. He'd looked at the couch, then back at me, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in his eyes. "Leo, your couch is not great." He wasn't wrong. It was old and lumpy, a relic from my first post-college apartment. Would it be weird if I just... He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward my bedroom. The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with unspoken implications. My bed was not the neutral territory of the couch. It was my most private space. Sharing it felt significant. But looking at his tired, shadowed face, I couldn't say no. The part of me that wanted to protect myself, the part that screamed this was a terrible idea, was silenced by the overwhelming, primal need to take care of him. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's not weird. It's a queen. There's plenty of room." That first night was a study in tension. We lay on opposite sides of the mattress, a rigid, uncrossable border of inches between us, our backs to each other. I was so aware of his presence, of the sound of his breathing, of the slight dip his weight made in the mattress, that I barely slept. I was a soldier on watch, every nerve ending firing. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small expanse of sheet. It was an intimacy so profound it felt like a violation, even though we weren't touching. I was inside his orbit in a new way, sharing the same air, the same space of unconsciousness. I felt like I was trespassing in a sacred place. But like everything else, it became normal. He started staying over more often than not. The rigid line down the middle of the bed softened, then disappeared altogether. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to find an arm thrown over my waist, or his leg tangled with mine. Sometimes I would wake to find he had migrated in his sleep until his face was buried in the space between my shoulder blades. Each time, my heart would perform a frantic, silent acrobatics routine. I would lie perfectly still, feigning sleep, soaking in the illicit closeness until he shifted away. We never spoke of it in the morning. We would wake up, make coffee, and talk about our plans for the day as if we hadn't just spent 8 hours entwined in a landscape of ambiguous intimacy. The door to my bedroom, once a clear boundary, was now perpetually left open for him. He would drift in after I was already in bed, a quiet shadow in the dark, and slip under the covers beside me. He never asked again if it was weird. It was simply what we did. This was my life now. A series of quiet, domestic rituals steeped in unspoken meaning. I was a scholar of subtlety, an archaeologist of intimacy, digging for clues in the ruins of his heartbreak. I analyzed the cadence of his breathing, the specific weight of his hand on my arm, the duration of a shared glance. I was living in a beautiful, fragile bubble of our own creation, a world that existed only within the four walls of my apartment. It was a world that felt more real than anything outside of it, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was built on a foundation of his need and my silence. and I had no idea how long it could possibly last before the whole thing came crashing down. I was simultaneously the happiest and the most terrified I had ever been in my life. Every day was a gift, and every day felt like it could be the last. The crossing happened on a Sunday night. It was late, storming outside. Rain lashed against the window panes in violent, percussive waves, and the wind howled a low, mournful song through the eaves of the old building. The storm felt like a physical manifestation of the charged atmosphere that had been building between us for weeks. We had foregone a movie, instead just listening to the rain and talking quietly in the low light of a single lamp. The conversation was deeper than usual, more reflective. He spoke about his parents, about his fears for his career, about a pervasive feeling of being adrift that had settled over him since the breakup. I listened, as I always did, but this time, it felt different. He wasn't just filling silence. He was excavating parts of himself and handing them to me for safekeeping. When we finally retreated to the bedroom, the air was thick with everything that had been said and everything that had not. We lay in bed, side by side on our backs, staring up at the ceiling where the shadows of tree branches danced in the flashing, erratic light of a distant thunderstorm. The usual, comfortable silence that settled between us at night was absent. In its place was a quiet so loud it was practically roaring, a silence humming with a potent, terrifying energy. I could feel the heat of his body next to mine, a magnetic pull that was almost physically painful to resist. I kept my hands clenched into fists at my sides, anchoring myself to my side of the bed. Leo, his voice was so soft it was almost carried away by the sound of the rain. It was not his usual tone. It held a tremor of vulnerability, a note of uncertainty that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. I turned my head on the pillow to look at him. In the dim light, his face was a landscape of shadows and soft edges. His eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were dark and serious, fixed on me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Yeah," I managed, my own voice a dry whisper. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. I watched as his throat worked, as he swallowed. The air crackled. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between us on the mattress. I felt as though I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping around me, and he was asking me to jump. "What are we doing?" he asked. The words so quiet, I felt them more than heard them. The question was a perfectly aimed stone, shattering the fragile glass of our unspoken arrangement. All the plausible deniability, all the carefully constructed narratives of friendship and comfort evaporated in an instant. We were left with the raw, undeniable truth of what had been building between us. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner against its cage. I had no answer. The truth was too dangerous to speak, and a lie felt like a betrayal. So I said nothing. I just held his gaze, letting my own fear, my own hope, my own years of silent yearning show in my eyes. I let him see it all. It was the most honest I had ever been with him. He saw it. I knew he did, because something in his expression shifted. The uncertainty softened into something else, something tender and resolved. He mirrored my movement, turning his head fully toward me. The space between our faces was now impossibly small. I could feel his breath on my cheek, warm and unsteady. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, and the question was a fragile thing, a glass bird held in his open palm. He didn't have to specify what it was. We both knew. The entire universe hung, suspended in that question. All the nights on the couch, all the late-night phone calls, all the shared silences, had led to this single, pivotal moment. This was the threshold. This was the precipice. And he was offering me the choice. I could step back, preserve the safety of the friendship, and spend the rest of my life wondering. Or I could jump. For a split second, the fear was overwhelming. The fear of ruining everything, of misinterpreting the most important moment of my life. But then I looked into his eyes, and I saw the same fear reflected there. He was just as terrified as I was. He wasn't the confident, unknowing initiator anymore. He was just Julian, lost and scared and asking for my permission to cross a line he had drawn himself. And in his fear, I found my courage. I didn't say yes. The word felt too small, too inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. Instead, I just gave the slightest of nods, a barely perceptible movement. It was enough. He closed the remaining distance between us with an agonizing slowness. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, a tentative exploration. His lips were soft, hesitant against mine, a gentle pressure that was more of a confession than a kiss. It was the taste of rain and salt and a quiet, desperate loneliness I recognized as my own. I brought a trembling hand up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble there, and I felt him shudder, a release of tension that seemed to run through his entire body. He deepened the kiss slightly, a silent plea for reassurance, and I gave it, kissing him back with all the years of unspoken affection I had kept locked away. It was a kiss that felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. It was quiet, and it was tentative, and it was everything. The morning after was a masterpiece of avoidance. I woke first, just as the gray light of dawn began to filter into the room, painting everything in muted shades of silver and charcoal. Julian was still asleep, turned away from me, a solid, warm line of heat against my back. The memory of the kiss, of the earth-shattering tenderness of it, was so vivid it felt branded onto my skin. I lay there for a long time, not moving, replaying the moment over and over, trying to convince myself it had been real. A quiet, profound joy was blooming in my chest, a fragile flower pushing its way through years of impacted soil. I felt hopeful. But when he stirred, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air, which had felt so full of promise, grew thin and brittle. He woke with a small, sharp intake of breath, as if startled. He didn't turn to look at me. He just lay there, perfectly still, his back a rigid wall. The silence was no longer the comfortable, meaning-laden quiet we had cultivated. It was a tense, anxious void. After a few minutes that stretched into an eternity, he swung his legs out of bed without a word, his movements stiff and economical. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I have to go, he muttered, pulling on the jeans he'd left crumpled on the floor. Early meeting I forgot about. It was a clumsy, transparent lie. It was Saturday, but I didn't call him on it. I couldn't find my voice. I just sat up, pulling the covers around me, and watched him dress. He moved around the room like a stranger, a polite guest in a foreign house, carefully avoiding any contact, both physical and visual. The easy intimacy we had built over the last few months had vanished, replaced by a chasm of awkwardness so wide I didn't know how we could ever cross it. He grabbed his keys from the dresser, mumbled a "see ya," and was gone, the quiet click of my front door closing behind him sounding like a gunshot in the still apartment. I sat there in the empty silence of my bedroom for a long time, the warmth from his side of the bed already beginning to cool. The fragile flower of hope in my chest withered and died, its petals turning to ash. A cold, heavy dread settled in its place. I had been wrong. I had misread everything. The kiss hadn't been a confession. It had been a mistake. A moment of lonely, storm-induced confusion on his part. A moment I had foolishly allowed myself to believe was something more. I had let him cross a line he hadn't understood, and now the harsh light of day had revealed the enormity of his regret. The pain was sharp and visceral, a physical ache in my sternum. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt. It was the terrifying, sickening realization that in my selfish desire for more, I had shattered the one thing I couldn't live without. I had lost my best friend. The withdrawal was swift and absolute. The ritual, the very thing that had become the scaffolding of my life, was dismantled overnight. The late-night calls stopped. My phone remained dark and silent, a mocking black mirror on my nightstand. The movie nights ceased to exist. My couch felt cavernously large and empty. He was suddenly, inexplicably busy. Texts went unanswered for hours, then days. When he did reply, his messages were short, polite, and distant. He was a ghost, a phantom limb I could still feel but could no longer see. Each day of his silence was a fresh turn of the knife. I cycled through a brutal emotional gauntlet, from grief to anger to a deep, hollowing despair. I tortured myself by replaying every moment, every conversation, every touch, searching for the sign I had missed, the warning I had ignored. Had I pushed him? Had my own silent yearning been so palpable that it had pressured him into something he didn't want? The self-doubt was a poison, seeping into every corner of my mind. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a cry for help as a declaration of love. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of a foundation of sand, and now I was standing alone in the ruins. After 2 weeks of this agonizing radio silence, I reached my breaking point. The not knowing was worse than any confirmation of my fears. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't work. The quiet of my apartment, once a sanctuary, was now a suffocating torment, amplifying the sound of his absence. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. I needed to hear it from him. I needed to see it in his eyes. One evening, fueled by a mixture of desperation and resolve, I walked the 12 blocks to his apartment. I stood outside his door for a full 10 minutes, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs, before I finally found the courage to knock. The door opened, and he was there. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had lost weight. He looked as haunted as I felt. Surprise flickered across his face when he saw me, quickly followed by a shuttered, guarded expression. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, a human barrier. "We need to talk, Julian," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "You can't just disappear. You can't do that. Not to me." He flinched at the accusation in my tone, but he didn't deny it. He just ran a hand through his already messy hair, a gesture of pure stress I knew so well. He looked past me, down the empty hallway, anywhere but at my face. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice low. "It was a mistake. Let's just forget it happened." Forget it happened? The words were a punch to the gut. All the pain and frustration of the last 2 weeks boiled over. Forget 2 months of you calling me every night? Forget you sleeping in my bed? Forget you kissing me and asking me if it was okay? You want me to just erase that? I can't do that, Julian. I'm not you. I can't just turn it off. My words hung in the stale air of the hallway between us. He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate pain that mirrored my own. His carefully constructed wall of indifference crumbled, and what was left was something broken and terrified. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, his eyes squeezed shut. "Leo, I can't. I don't know what's happening. I lie awake at night, and my head is just screaming. Everything feels wrong. I look in the mirror, and I don't know who I'm looking at anymore." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, lost. "It's you," he said, the words barely audible. "It's always been you, hasn't it? Underneath everything. I think I've just been too scared to see it. That night, with the storm, it wasn't a mistake. That's what terrifies me. It was the only thing that's felt real in months. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to be that person." His confession was not a triumphant declaration of love. It was a raw, painful admission of fear and confusion. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. He had pulled away not because he felt nothing, but because he felt everything, and the sheer, unexpected force of it had shaken the very foundations of his identity. He was terrified of what it meant for his life, for who he thought he was, for who he was supposed to be. And in his terror, he had hurt the one person who had been his safe harbor. The anger and hurt I had been carrying drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just a man, lost in a new and frightening country, without a map. And he was terrified he was going to have to navigate it alone. His words, fractured and raw, hung in the space between us, dismantling the narrative of rejection I had so painstakingly built in my mind. He wasn't pushing me away. He was drowning, and in his panic, he had pushed away the only life raft he had. Seeing the sheer, unvarnished terror in his eyes, I understood. This wasn't about me, not really. It was about the cataclysmic shift within him, the tectonic plates of his own identity grinding against each other. The confrontation I had initiated, born of my own pain, suddenly transformed. It was no longer an interrogation, but an invitation. I opened my mouth to respond, to offer some kind of reassurance, but I found I had no words. Instead, I did the only thing that felt right. I closed the small gap between us, stepped past the threshold of his doorway, and gently wrapped my arms around him. For a moment, he remained rigid, a statue of tension and conflict. And then, with a shuddering exhale that seemed to carry the weight of his entire world, he collapsed against me. His arms came around my back, clutching the fabric of my jacket with a desperate strength, and he buried his face in my shoulder. I felt the dampness of his tears soaking through my shirt, and I just held him, my hand coming up to cradle the back of his head, my fingers tangling in his soft hair. We stood there in his doorway, two broken pieces fitting together, and he wept. He wept for his confusion, for his fear, for the 2 weeks of lonely agony he had put us both through. And I held him through it, anchoring him as I always had, my own tears silently tracing paths down my face, tears of relief, of sorrow, of a deep and abiding love that had weathered the storm. When his sobs finally subsided, we moved, as if by unspoken agreement, to his couch. We sat, not touching at first, the aftermath of the emotional deluge leaving the air quiet and clean. We talked then, truly talked, for the first time. The conversation was not easy. It was halting and messy, full of long pauses and difficult admissions. He told me about the panic that had seized him that morning after the kiss, the overwhelming feeling that he had crossed a line from which there was no return, and the path ahead was a terrifying, unknown wilderness. He spoke of a lifetime of expectations, from his family, from society, from himself, and the dizzying vertigo of realizing that the future he had always envisioned for himself might not be the one he actually wanted. He confessed that my apartment, my presence, had become the only place he felt truly himself, and that realization, that dependency, had scared him as much as the kiss itself. I listened, and when he was done, I talked. I told him about my own years of silence, about the walls I had built to protect our friendship, about the careful dance of hope and resignation I had been performing for nearly a decade. I told him that I had fallen in love with him not because he was confused or lonely, but because of who he was at his core, the bright, kind, and deeply good man who had befriended a quiet boy in a laundry room all those years ago. I told him I wasn't an answer to his confusion, and I didn't want to be. I just wanted to be with him, to navigate the wilderness together, if he'd let me. I laid my own fear bare, that I would only ever be a port in his storm, a temporary comfort to be abandoned once he found his way back to clearer waters. His eyes, when he met mine, were clear and steady for the first time since that night. "You're not the port, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the lighthouse, and you're the shore. You're home." I was just too afraid to admit I'd been lost for a very long time. He reached out then, his hand covering mine where it rested on the cushion between us. His touch was not ambiguous or accidental. It was deliberate. It was an answer. It was a promise. That conversation was the new foundation. We began again, but this time with intention, with honesty. The ambiguity was gone, stripped away by the painful but necessary confrontation, leaving behind something stronger, more resilient. The rituals we had built returned, but they were different now, imbued with a new meaning. The late-night calls were no longer born of loneliness, but of a simple desire to connect, to share the last thoughts of the day. The movie nights on the couch were no longer a dance of plausible deniability. They were an open expression of affection, his head resting on my chest not as a refuge from grief, but as his rightful place. We reclaimed my bedroom as our shared space. The first night he stayed over after our talk, he paused at the door, a flicker of the old uncertainty in his eyes. I just smiled, took his hand, and led him inside. I closed the door behind us, the soft click of the latch a definitive, symbolic sound. This was our room now. There was no invisible line down the middle of the bed. We slept tangled together, a comfortable, easy knot of limbs, his breath a warm, steady presence against my neck. Waking up next to him was no longer a source of anxiety, but a quiet, profound joy. We would watch the morning light spill into the room, talking about nothing and everything, the simple domesticity of it feeling more sacred than any grand romantic gesture. We learned a new language together, one spoken not just in words, but in small, everyday acts of care. The way he would make me a cup of coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. The way I would gently trace the lines on his palm when he was stressed. We were learning to heal, not just from his breakup or our recent conflict, but from the years of silence and misunderstanding that had preceded it. We were developing a new photograph together, watching as the image of our future slowly, beautifully emerged from the chemical bath of our shared vulnerability. The fear hadn't vanished entirely. It still lurked in the shadows sometimes, a quiet whisper of doubt, but it no longer had the power to separate us. We faced it together, our hands intertwined. I think back to that first night, me lying on the couch with him asleep on my chest, feeling like I was on a precipice. I was right. It was a threshold, but I had it wrong. I thought I was on the edge of a great, terrifying fall. I didn't realize that I was actually standing at the door to a room I had been searching for my entire life. A room filled with a quiet, steady light. A room that felt, finally, like home. We found our way there not through a grand, sweeping gesture, but through 1,000 small, hesitant steps toward each other in the dark. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together. And in that quiet, we found everything.